Good evening and welcome to the first of our pre-season panel events at Opera Holland Park. I'm delighted to welcome tonight to discuss the forthcoming production of The Marriage of Figaro and Figaro itself and the Beaumarchais and all sorts of strange connections between the master and servant relations and comedy and seriousness. We have Judith Flanders, journalist and author of 7, or is it 8 now, works of non-fiction, largely centered around the 19th century. She is also the creator of the Sam Clare mysteries, Sam Clare being a literary editor turned sleuth. I think we're all going to be sleuths tonight of one sort or another. We also have Nicholas Till, Professor of Opera and Music Theatre at the University of Sussex, and Pierre Audi Chair in Opera and Music Theatre at the Centre for Research in Opera and Music Theatre at the University of Amsterdam. Nick is editor of the Cambridge Companion to Opera Studies and author of Mozart and the Enlightenment, Truth, Virtue and Beauty in Mozart's Opera. Here it is. George Jackson. Welcome, George. George is the conductor of this summer's production of The Marriage of Figaro, last seen at Opera Holland Park, conducting Così fan tutte. George has worked with Opera de Rouen, Frankfurt Staatsoper, the Orchestra de Paris, and he trained in Vienna. So that gives him a unique insight. We're going to kick off this evening by actually listening back to a recording made by Julian van Mellart's, our count, in this season's production, singing Hai già vinta la causa with Stuart Wilde at the piano at the Opera Holland Park Gala of 2019.
Hai già vinta la causa, cosa sento? In qual lato io cadea? Perfidi, io voglio di tal modo punirvi, a piacer mio la sentenza sarà. Ma se pagasse la vecchia pulta intente, pagarla in qual maniera? E poi per Antonio che un incognito Figaro ricusa di dare una nipote in matrimonio. Coltivando l'orgoglio di questo mentecato.
Ah no, lasciarti in pace, non
A hot reaction there from the account, having overheard Susanna and Figaro in conversation. That's Act 3, Scene 3 of The Marriage of Figaro. We have a French play set in Spain, made into an Italian opera for a Viennese audience by an Austrian composer and an Italian librettist with an English soprano as its leading lady. Where does Figaro actually sit at home? Can I turn to you first, Nick?
Can you just ask the question? Yep. Can you just ask the question again? Where does
Figaro actually sit? Where is it at home, considering how polyglot all the different influences are?
Okay. Well, I think the first thing is that that Mozart would probably have queried his designation as being Austrian, because of course he came from Salzburg, which was an independent state. So we've got another bit in the mix there. It's an opera buffa, which is essentially an Italian genre, but it's a genre like opera seria, Italian opera seria, which composers of all nationalities tried their hands at, because Italian opera was the universal opera genre at that time. But the thing that makes it more complex, obviously, is not just that Mozart is a German composer, but that, as you say, it's a French play, and it's modeled. The play itself has elements of the old Italian commedia dell'arte tradition of servants who outwit their masters, and Beaumarchais takes this fairly routine sort of genre of commedia dell'arte and actually then turns it into a political drama. So what had been just cocking a snoop at aristocrats and yes, isn't it funny, becomes actually a real class confrontation between servants and masters. And Beaumarchais, that's very clear in Beaumarchais, and we get this great tirade in the middle of the play from Figaro, which is a great rant against those who are born to power without deserving the power and wealth they've been given, which in the opera gets toned down a little bit, but nonetheless, Mozart very clearly connects to that aspect of the drama from his own experience, because he himself felt constantly that he wasn't recognized for his ability, that he talks a lot about my honor being impugned by aristocrats. He is permanently furious with his employer, the Archbishop of Salzburg, to the extent that he actually finally is so cheeky to the Archbishop's steward that he literally gets himself kicked down the stairs. So this is very much, Mozart taking these genre conventions, opera buffa, commedia dell'arte, French satire, and turning it into a very personal expression of something that he himself felt strongly.
Why Spain?
Well, mainly because the censor, the French censor, made it a condition that it couldn't be set in France because that was too close to home, as it were. So it was, if you set it in Spain, it's another country, and everyone knows Spain is a bit backward socially at that time. So it's not such a sharp kind of critique.
Well, was there also that? I mean, we see it much later on in Carmen, but I mean, was there also a sense of Spain as being a hotter climate? Therefore, people in a hotter climate were going to be.
I've just lost you for a moment, but I don't. I mean, I think Beaumarchais had dealings in Spain. He had business dealings, dodgy business dealings. He knew Spain, and of course, anyway, the Barber of Seville had been set in Spain, so it has to follow on from there. But yes, if we imagine that the Spanish are supposedly more hot-headed and so on, then maybe Beaumarchais has that in mind too. Yeah.
George, having studied in Vienna, I mean, we all know that there's a massive sort of musical tourism thing going on about Mozart. I mean, obviously less so in Vienna, just about, than in Salzburg. But does he still feel very much like one of the city's composers? Do they feel that they own him?
I think there's an element of that. Yeah, I think Vienna, for me at least, it's not so much that it's necessarily a musical city, but actually the fact that it's such a theatrical city. And in a way, I think you forget that it's not just about going to the Musikverein or going to the Staatsoper or any of the other theatres. Actually, the Burgtheater, as it was then, but still now, is the foremost German language straight theatre in the German-speaking territories, and it was very much set up under that Joseph II kind of Enlightenment idea. And so I think this theatrical tradition stretches back and is very much still present. And I think in a way they kind of see opera very much as a continuation of the sort of tradition of theatre that's very much in the city. And I think in some way that's where, particularly in the 1780s, that's where this fits into, rather than as something separate.
Okay. Much of opera is about the how and the why, rather than the what, the where, and the when. I became aware that there's a similarly short time frame between the Beaumarchais play and Mozart's opera as there is between Dumas' La Dame aux Camélias and La Traviata. There's a lot of plot going on, and it's all carried very well. Actually, listening to Julian singing the Count's aria just then, I was aware that he wasn't actually just reacting to what he'd heard. He was also giving us a helpful here's what happened so far in that, reminding us that, you know, Antonio is Susanna's uncle, all of the various intrigues, reminding us about Marcellina, her contract to marry Figaro. There is a lot of plot going on. Did Mozart and Ponte assume knowledge of the play amongst their audience, or did they just take it over and repackage it, not thinking that people would know the play?
Is this a question for me, or?
Oh, you're welcome to have a go. Anybody.
Well, I think what's interesting is that although we're out of the kind of Handel world of lots of dry recitative and then an aria and then recitative again, I wonder whether if you went to the theatre in 1786, I wonder whether people really would have been quiet throughout all the recitatives. So I wonder whether there's a part of the whole thing, it's a bit like on those TV shows where you get the last time on the episode and then they go into the new episode.
Previously.
Whether perhaps Mozart's conscious of the fact that, well, or De Ponte, more to the point, is conscious of the fact that somebody very, very obviously, especially in Italian, in an Austrian audience, might have missed a certain plot point, as we working on the opera constantly do when it comes to studying it. So I think there's an element of can a piece of music that's demanding attention from the audience, can that stand up on its own and keep people kind of involved in the drama, which is probably something which might come from the Gluck idea about let's actually try and get really focused on the narrative flow of the drama rather than ignore what happens in the dry recitatives.
There's a great deal. I mean, I'm guilty of this, of sort of casually referring to Figaro as being revolutionary, by which I don't just mean musically, which is something I'd like to talk to you about more, George, but as embodying the spirit of revolution. And Danton said Figaro killed off the aristocracy. Nick, you're more of a mind that it's an Enlightenment work, aren't you? Could you please give us a really sort of potted idea of what Enlightenment thought is?
Well, I mean, absolutely. Basically, it's as the philosophes, as they were called, of the Enlightenment said, it is belief in the rule of reason, that you should question superstition, you should question authority just based upon tradition, you should question beliefs that didn't uphold the rights of individuals and so on. So to that extent, I mean, for many people, the French Revolution is the outcome of the Enlightenment. I should also have said there's belief in science too. I mean, Newton is the great sort of hero of the Enlightenment, and the belief in faith in science is again faith in reason, and of course, you know, we're back there again, aren't we? Because faith in science is questioned in our day. So, you know, this is an ongoing. Enlightenment is never over. It's an unfinished project, as one scholar said. So,
so they're pre-truth rather than post-truth.
Who's pre-truth? Well, I mean,
you're talking about science and being questioned about science.
Well, they believed that, I mean, and I said they, I mean, people like Voltaire, who actually wrote a book about Newton, believed that, you know, science was the rational way of trying to understand how to order the world. But I mean, let's leave science aside because it doesn't come up in Figaro. But one of the targets of the Enlightenment was the old feudal system, the system whereby people inherited, you know, rights over other people and so on. And Beaumarchais takes this element of the story, which is the supposed notion of the droit de seigneur, the right of the seigneur to enjoy any young woman who is about to get married. There's very little evidence that this actually did exist as a feudal right, but a play had been written about it called a droit de seigneur before Beaumarchais, and Beaumarchais picks up this idea and makes that the sort of focal point of what is obviously in fact a much broader critique of the ancien regime, the old regime of the nobility and the king, which is based on nothing but inherited power and wealth.
I was reading somewhere that droit de seigneur had an alternative title. It was droit de cuisse, so right of the thighs, which is rather alarming.
A bit more graphic, yes.
But it was abolished, I think, alongside dovecoats after the French Revolution. But Judith, the whole notion of droit de seigneur, it's a red herring, really, isn't it? Because the female servant would always be at the mercy of a degree of, I suppose, what we'd call today sexual harassment by their masters.
This is really the thing, is what you're looking at is a power structure. It doesn't matter whether it was a true right. It was an absolute right in the sense that masters had the lives of their servants at their mercy. And we're not talking now purely about the 18th century. We're talking about the 19th century. We're talking about a great deal of the 20th century. This is just a reality that there was no possibility for most women in service to avoid either predatory other higher servants or predatory household males. It was just the deal. And unlike Marcellina, the odds were when you got pregnant, which you had little hope of avoiding in these circumstances, you had to abandon your child because otherwise you would lose your job. You would probably, unlike Marcellina, lose your job anyway, but at least then you could go and work for somebody else. And so what you've got in this opera is just this very matter-of-fact reality turned into comedy. I've always been interested. I once saw a pub theater production of this opera, which, by the way, was fantastic. And the best part of it, I felt, was that normally you open up and there's Figaro measuring out his bedroom, which is usually the size of 4 people's houses because it's on an opera stage. In a pub theater, you see, he can just about fit in a pallet. And then, of course, you get this Marx Brothers scenario with all these people tumbling into the room. Because, of course, this is the other reality of service, particularly in the 18th century, and particularly in Europe, is there's no privacy. Our idea of service, which mostly comes from, depending on your age, upstairs, downstairs, or Downton Abbey, is that there's a servant's wing and separate quarters and a separate staircase. And if that happened, and it happened in very few places, it was 19th century. Earlier, servants more or less lived intermingled with their employers. They slept, like Figaro, basically in the corridor outside their master's bedroom. Maids slept on the floor or in the bed with their mistresses. This was just the norm for most of the period we're talking about. So what you've got with this opera is this very real fear that the upper classes had about their servants. They knew everything. This opera of eavesdropping is reality.
Thank you. George, eavesdropping, voices overheard. What is going on in the music with this? How closely pressing in is the musical writing in these, you know, fragmentary conversations, people trying to whisper in private, people trying to communicate stuff? I'm thinking about the terrific Act 2 finale, where we have Susanna's in the cupboard, and then the Count thinks that it's Cherubino in the cupboard, and everybody's rushing around. There's tons of dance music floating through this, isn't there?
I think in reference to the idea of eavesdropping, it's interesting because young singers tend to know Mozart, first of all, through arias that they will sing in, you know, audition or kind of competitive situations. And then often after that process, they might then do a production. And it's only then that you realize, well, this aria is sung in a kind of secret wood in the dark. And I've been singing it top of my voice loud, you know, all the time. And so actually a lot of this, the process of putting this opera kind of on its feet on a stage, is realizing that, you know, in reference to this kind of claustrophobia, actually this line, you know, or this conversation that might be happening in a recitative, we have to go for the quieter dynamics, or the whispered dynamics, or at least this focus on what Mozart often writes in the ensemble, sotto voce, meaning under voice, or lowered voice at least. And so I think a lot of the work musically is finding a sort of a style of attacking the consonants, for example, in the words, where they're, like in whispering, very, very clear, and they can cut through a kind of texture, but there's not the sustain that you find in big sort of, like the Brindisi of Traviata, for example, where everyone's having a great drinking song. Actually, it's quite difficult it's almost going against the nature of public singing by trying to find a way to be secretive and to find those dynamics. And then regarding the dancing, I think that's something we've lost in our culture. Viennese people in the 18th century, they would have known these dances. There would have been associations with the dances. And I think an audience would have known, okay, that's a minuet. That's the dance that the couple does at the dinner before, when everyone's arriving, before, in front of everyone, to sort of show off a bit, for example. And I think that we lose that. I mean, when you're talking about the Act 2 finale, the music that accompanies...
George there, or maybe we're losing me. No, it's me. Carry on, George, please.
The music that Susanna comes out of the cupboard to is a minuet.
Yes.
And you kind of think, well, why is it a minuet? I mean, how unusual is that actually, you know, this kind of mistake between the various characters happens, and I think the minuet emphasizes the fact that there should be a reference to it's a lower class character dancing, in inverted commas, to a higher classed dance. I think it's also the same in the Act 4 finale. There's a contradance, which is something similar to our sort of Cayley barn dance, where everybody's in a line and you have the couples going within the couples to the end and then dancing on their own, then joining the line. I think we've all done it at a wedding at some point in that respect. And that dance is the dance that the Count tries to seduce his wife, the Countess, which he thinks is Susanna. And actually you've got this situation where the Count and the Countess are seducing one another with a contradance, and then later on, Susanna and Figaro are doing it the same thing, but with a minuet. So this invasion of the different types of dance and the social classes is there in the music. I think that's a level of the comedy which we have to kind of almost emphasize slightly too much to a modern audience to make it clear that that's how it's changed.
And that's set up right from Figaro's aria in Act 1, Se vuol ballare, because when he realizes that the Count has intentions on Susanna, he sings this aria in which he says, okay, if you want to dance, little Mr. Count, I'll play the tune. And it starts out as a minuet, which is a mocking minuet, you know, very gracious and everything. This is you think this is your aristocratic dance, but I'll play the tune. And it goes into what is called a hopping dance, a sort of a very unseemly kind of, you know, middle class popular dance, which someone as elevated as the Count would not deign to dance. But Figaro says, you know, you'll dance to my tune. And that runs, all the way through, as George is saying. That point is so when Susanna comes out of the cupboard with the minuet, it's a mocking minuet. It's almost as if she'd heard Figaro himself, singing that, and she then comes out perkily, mocking the Count, and the Count knows he's being mocked. That's what's going on in that aria, that everyone around him is mocking him, and he can't do anything about it. And another point about that aria, when we're talking about class, it's a classic vengeance aria, which is a genre that comes from opera seria. Almost every opera seria has a vengeance aria in it, and Mozart wrote quite a lot of vengeance arias too. There's another one in the opera, as it happens, a comic one by Dr. Bartolo. But this vengeance aria is actually kind of elevating the Count's status in one sense. It's saying he's a character from opera seria. He's not a comic character. But at the same time, you kind of think, yes, but Mozart is kind of mocking him also, because he isn't a king or a prince from mythology or Roman history. He may be aristocratic, but he's not a character from opera seria. So Mozart is playing with that kind of genre convention too.
I think also regarding that point, with the relationship to opera seria, this concept of accompanied recitative, so a recitative where the orchestra is playing and amplifying what the singers are saying. It's interesting that it's just the Countess and then the Count in the aria that Julian just sung. We hear the accompanied recits happening with them, and only after do we see Susanna and Figaro having a go at their own accompanied recits. And so you get this.
Yes, are they effectively sort of ennobled by?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Well, this sort of important idea that the characters are on a journey, and we know that all of Mozart's opera characters are always on a kind of a long trajectory over the course of an opera. But certainly the fact that Figaro and Susanna, their kind of highest emotional state, they suddenly adopt this old opera seria elevated characteristic. I think that's an enormous thing, which you just forget in the 21st century. You think, oh, there's another recitative with the orchestra, and it's important, I think, in the development.
Just to go back to the dancing thing, Judith, have you ever seen in your other life as a dance critic? Have you ever seen a fandango?
Probably. Did that sound definite enough?
Yes, that sounds definite enough. It covers it. Because I was reading an interesting paper the other day by the musicologist Dorothea Link. Nick's probably familiar with this, in which she was talking about the fandango in the wedding scene of the Marriage of Figaro. And this kind of goes back to what you were saying about Se vuol ballare. Apparently it was Figaro who danced the fandango, which at the time was considered an extremely provocative dance. I mean, so much so that Casanova writes about it, and saying when he saw it danced in Spain as opposed to in Italy or France, he was quite shocked. I think he finishes up by saying, "I cannot believe that any woman who danced with a man who was dancing the fandango could ever refuse him." Does the fandango appear in other Mozart operas? Does it reappear in Don Giovanni? George?
No, I think what's important about this fandango is that it's a direct lifting from Gluck's Don Juan, the ballet. So it's sort of a double reference, because it's a reference back to the 1760s to the Don Juan of Gluck, which was very, very well known in all the Vienna theatres. But also, I mean, there's some evidence with the fandango that there was also a competitive element between two male dancers who might have competed, kind of showing off their steps at each other. And so I've always wondered whether it's also a bit of a reference to the idea that Figaro, who's finally marrying the person he wants to marry, is sort of aiming it quite aggressively at the Count, which is one of the descriptions of the fandango when it's not being danced by a couple.
It would be quite interesting to see them dance it together, wouldn't it, really? Just going back to how realistic, or as we'd say today, relatable the opera is. There's a wealth of 18th century literature on life in service: Samuel Richardson's Pamela, Henry Fielding's Shamala, The Anonymous Adventures of a Valet, which does sound like a film from the 1970s. And John MacDonald, a manservant, was very successful with travels in various parts of Europe, Asia, and Africa. There was also advice from potential servants. And I think this feeds back into what Judith was saying earlier about the dangers of a life in service. 1786, familiar date, John Moyer published Female Tuition, or An Address to Mothers on the Education of Daughters. It's worth reading this quote out. So profligate and abandoned is the world become, that you had better turn your daughter into the street at once than place her out to service. For 10 to 1, her master shall seduce her. Was the world actually getting worse in 1786? Judith?
I think everyone thinks the world is getting worse. I don't know quite how one judges that, certainly not in terms of, are you going to get seduced by your employer? I think there's always a sense of, in my day, things were much better, and now the world's gone to hell in a handcart. One thing we do know is that, and again, this might be a thing of record keeping, so it's never terribly exact. We do see the figures for the number of children abandoned going up, but equally we see them going up, particularly in times of hardship. So this isn't necessarily about more women having illegitimate children, it's more women having children that they simply cannot afford to keep. I mean, we do know, Nick was talking about Enlightenment thought and the philosophe. We do know Rousseau had all of Rousseau's children were abandoned. This was not unusual at all. They're figures that to us are bizarrely and shockingly high. In France at this period, it's about 25% of all live births. In Prague, a little bit later, a couple of decades later, the records say it's 40%, 4 in every 10 live births. The children are abandoned. So part of it is economic hardship. Part of it is the mores of the time and what people will or will not tolerate in terms of employing women with children. Is it worse? Is it better? I'm not sure I know what worse means.
Well, I can perhaps make a suggestion here, worse, better, because I mean, one of the mysteries, of course, about this play, about this opera, but the play as well, is that it is critical of the established regimes, the aristocracy, and so on. So one of the questions is, why did, well, in the first instance, in the end, King Louis XVI personally permit the play to be performed? But then more particularly, why did Joseph II in Vienna allow Mozart to turn it into an opera barely 2 years after the huge succès de scandale that the play had created, particularly when he had banned the play, a publication of the play in German. But he let Mozart make it into an opera. And the reason for this is I think, pretty clear, that Joseph II was himself what was called an enlightened despot. He was an absolutist ruler, but he absorbed the theories, the progressive theories of the Enlightenment, and tried to implement them in his countries. And amongst those reforms he did, one was the ending of serfdom, so the ending of the direct feudal relationships. And part of that was a very strong law to allow freedom of marriage for servants, that servants should be, be allowed to have effective marriage relationships, not just be told, you've got to marry my footman so that you'll be in the bedroom next to me, and so on, which the lords had the right to do, to prevent servants from marrying. So to that extent, that confirms what Judith is saying about the power that masters have over the servants. But Joseph was attacking feudalism, because he saw that feudalism was actually holding his empire, his territories back. So he wanted to unleash more progressive aspects, so that actually the opera confirms to some extent Joseph's own policies, because it endorses them. It says, people who are in love should be allowed to marry freely. And it is something Mozart himself explicitly says when he writes a letter to his father. And a young sort of lower noble aristocratic acquaintance of theirs has married a rich young woman. And he says, well, that will have just been an arranged marriage. The people like that never marry for love, but we ordinary people, we do marry for love, and that's much better. So he actually directly talks about this. So actually, the politics of the opera do actually conform to Joseph's own policies, political views. So, and I think that's why Joseph allowed it to go ahead, because the audience at the theatre, it's the court opera, was going to be the aristocracy, and the opera tells the aristocracy, who Joseph is fighting with the whole time, because they're holding on to their privileges and he's stripping away their privileges. So he's in a war with them anyway. This opera absolutely puts his message across to them. Have we lost Anna for a moment?
I thought I'd lost you. Am I back? Are you back?
You're back.
I'm here. Was I lost?
No.
I don't need good.
I think you lost me. I think it's just worth just thinking about Mozart again, and the social situation of a composer who had, when we think about Haydn, we think about him as until he came to London as having to wear livery and definitely being a member of a household. Mozart was independent. Reading through things like Michael Kelly's reminiscences, it sounds almost idyllic, apart from the constant worry about where the next money was going to come from. How unusual was it for a composer to walk away from patronage?
Who would you like to answer that?
I'm so sorry, Nick, or George, or Judith.
It's part of a tendency that will happen increasingly at this period, but there's no doubt that Mozart is making a stand when he does this. He knows that he's challenging the accepted norms. His father is devastated. They've trailed all around Europe trying to find a court appointment. He'd hoped to get a job in Munich and so on. This was the expectation entirely. And, his father would have been, was disappointed that he was stuck in Salzburg, because his father recognized that Salzburg was a bit of a backwater, but nonetheless that was security and whatever. And Mozart is, when he gets to Vienna, he arrives in the entourage of the Archbishop, and he immediately sees that, what the opportunities are. There's an economic boom happening. People are wanting, piano lessons. They're wanting someone to play in their soirees and salons and things. And he writes to his father and he says, I could make 10 times my meager annual salary in Salzburg here by playing concerts and so on. He very, very knowingly sets himself up as a freelance entrepreneur, and he's got in with the sort of progressive aristocracy. He writes to his father and says, I'm absolutely furious because the Archbishop made me stay home the other evening and play some silly music, or in case he wanted some music. And I'd been invited to Countess Thun's house where the emperor was coming, and I could have met him. So he sees all these opportunities. He is, in that sense, he is, it's a significant historical moment. He's not the only composer who was ever a freelancer. Handel was a freelancer in London. It was still, London was London. London is the progressive city where that might be possible. Handel also has sort of semi-patrons like the Chandos and so on. So people piece together sort of mixed economies of a bit of patronage, like Beethoven, a bit of patronage here, a bit of skullduggery with publishers there. It's a sort of mixed kind of way of thinking. But it's very striking that Mozart sees so clearly what the future is going to be and what the risks are going to be too.
I think also it's interesting because people always associate Beethoven as the sort of starving artist entrepreneur who puts on his 6-hour-long concerts with all his latest music. But actually, it's so true that Mozart really is the one that does this and is able to under Joseph II. And I think also we forget that the piano concertos, they were just an incredible entrepreneurial approach to here's me playing and writing and charging for the entrance to the concerts and
booking the hall and booking all the musicians. Yeah. How the hell does someone without a telephone book an orchestra of for the right evening and so on? And he didn't have anyone to help him with it, as far as we know. He did it all himself. So he was operating, as an entrepreneurial business operator. I think we've lost Anna again, haven't we?
Just to go on until she comes back, it is really the rise of the middle class that we're watching there.
Yes. Mozart himself would have been ambivalent about identifying himself with Figaro and Susanna, because his whole shtick was that he wasn't a servant. He didn't want to be treated as a servant. He didn't want to have to sit with the other servants in the servants' quarter having his dinner, So he wouldn't have completely identified himself, and he's actually very rude about his own servants in his letters. So he was not all, he was also a master in his own right. There was one poor young woman who gets the brunt of his complaints. I think she was sick in her bed or something like that, and he's absolutely furious. So he's already seeing himself as the new middle class, basically, certainly not as a servant.
I think Anna's back.
Which is true also of Figaro, yes?
Well, Figaro and Susanna are always going to be servants. But they're going to be servants who've at least, been able to marry and make their own life.
But we also, we know from the Beaumarchais, if you read the Barber of Seville, the precursor, we know that Figaro had tried to make it as an actor and as a singer.
Quite true, and indeed he's working as a barber, so that's a lower class status, but it's not a servant role. So that's right. Yes.
And he's very critical, interestingly, of all actors and all critics and all audiences and publics, which you can't help think is Mozart really really talking through his characters.
And Rosina is not born to the aristocracy. She marries into the aristocracy. So the only person that we have of the aristocracy on stage is actually the Count.
Yeah.
Which brings me to the question I'm really wanting to be asked. Is he adult or a predator or both? David Coward, I think, said that it's impossible to imagine Valmont in Dangerous Liaisons being quite so easily fooled in his
I
attempts.
think the difference there is, Valmont is a sadist. I mean, he's getting, for those who don't know, this is Les Liaisons Dangereuses, these two predatory aristocrats aim to seduce other sort of innocents, but it's a competition between each other, and they've got some very complex sort of sadosexual thing going on in the way that they plot to destroy basically these people who they want to seduce, whereas the Count doesn't have much machination really. He just wants to get his leg over as soon as he can before Susanna's got married. I don't think he's got any other sort of complex sort of sadistic games going on. So I think that's the difference.
But there is the plot with Barberina. What's going on there? And Barberina's aria, that's your favourite moment, isn't it, Judith?
It is, but I think that's, when you look at him, and he, as Nick says, he doesn't have much machination in him. He hasn't had to. It's easy. They're there. They're at your mercy. In a way, the date of this and the precursor, as you said, to the revolution, what you're seeing is somebody saying no to him for the first time. And in effect, the whole opera is him just being astonished by this. No one's ever said no.
But isn't this is more or less the plot of Don Giovanni as well, though, isn't it? Because, he doesn't get laid in the course of the opera either, does he?
He doesn't get laid. It's slightly different, isn't it? Because in Don Giovanni, at least two of the women I'm counting now are of his own class.
Yeah.
Whereas the Count hits on his servants who haven't got any power.
Yeah.
So, there's he doesn't approach anyone who in the past would have been able to say no. And indeed, they can't say no. All they can do is outwit him.
I wonder, I've been thinking about this a lot recently, watching, I think somebody alluded earlier to, Upstairs, Downstairs and Downton Abbey. I wonder what our continued fascination with this is, the master-servant relationship. I mean, it's a seam of comedy and drama that goes back centuries and centuries and centuries, isn't it, Judith?
Well, it goes back. I mean, the Roman comedies, whether you're looking at Terence or Plautus, it's a dim, rich man who thinks he is smarter than he is and has to be rescued by, in of course, Roman comedy, by his slave, but later on by the servant who is intelligent. And you get, as you have here, you get the topsy-turvy. The servant is smarter than the master, and so the servant manipulates the master. And this goes on whether you're looking at Don Quixote or whether you're looking at the Pickwick Papers or whether you're looking at Jeeves and Wooster. This is an absolute staple comedy trope from the earliest comedies we have. And whether it's forcing people to get dressed up, men dressed as women, this is entirely, this is part of the template.
One Man, Two Governors, based on Goldoni. So yes, it doesn't stop. There was a lovely section I watched recently from Gosford Park, in which Helen Mirren's character, the housekeeper, Mrs. Wilson, who has herself, along with her sister, given up a child that was fathered by Sir William, was it? Yeah, Sir William McCaudle. It sort of echoes the question posed by Beaumarchais, by Figaro in the Beaumarchais, but do you think you would be a decent servant? She says, what gift is it that you think a good servant has? It's anticipation. I know when they'll be hungry. I know when they'll be tired. I know it before they know it themselves. So yes, they know everything. And I suppose the secret to happiness with Figaro and Susanna is the fact that they're not trying to eavesdrop on each other. They're not trying to plot against each other. The very first time we see them, they're not even listening to each other. They're comfortable ignoring each other, as people would be in a long, happy marriage. We get the cut through to the end, really. What is it that lifts it from a simple bedroom farce or a period piece? What is it that makes us come back to it, even though we know that gorgeous moment of stillness right before the end is probably only temporary? Judith?
I think it's quite simple. It's the music that brings us back. I mean, do I need to see a servant outwitting his master again? The same servant and the same master? No. But if they're going to sing as well as they do, and sing music as beautiful as they are, okay, sure, jump out the window again.
George?
I think I completely agree with Judith, actually. Yes, it is the music, but I think also what's fascinating about it is the fact that if you look at Mozart's wordless or songless music, the piano concertos, the symphonies, the string quartets, all of the chamber music, this sort of amazingly characterized style of writing that he's developed over his life. Suddenly, you give it words and you give it characters, and then actually that's sort of where, I mean, I have this constant debate where if you could pick a composer's the side of a composer's output, whether it's just the theatre music or just the symphonic music, say, or something, I always continue to argue that with Mozart, you have to pick the theatre music, because what he does, in a way that I think Beethoven tried to do a little bit with Fidelio, is he imports this incredibly developed, elegant style of all of the symphonies and all of the chamber music. He imports it into a world where there are real stories and real characters and there's a language and everything's there. And I think that's where he can flourish, because it's just that combination of elements working so well together.
Nick?
Well, I've always felt that apart from being a bedroom farce, it's also a drama about loss of innocence. It's actually a drama about the fall from innocence. Again and again, characters are talking about. I mean, Figaro in Non più his are non più andrai depicts Cherubino is going to be expelled from the garden of innocence. Okay, sexual. He's got sexual desires, but nonetheless they're innocent. He's going to be expelled into the real world, kicked out. Figaro depicts the real world as a battlefield. The Countess talks about loss, and perhaps maybe this is why it's Judith's favorite aria, but Barberina, the young gardener's daughter, who sings this little poignant, very brief little aria, I've lost it, L'ho perduto. And she's meant to be saying that she's lost the pin that she's been given, to make sure that the pin is given to is it from the Count to Susanna, or Susanna to the Count? I can't remember which way around it is.
From the Count to Susanna to confirm.
Yes. So she feels this terrible responsibility, and she sings this desolate little aria. But actually, what she's saying is I've lost my innocence, because the Count is also after her, and you know, we've all lost our innocences, and so the opera has this whole other sort of kind of layer of poignancy about it, I think, that takes it far beyond just a comedy romp.
We're going to wrap it up fairly shortly, but I think before we do, it might be nice to just dwell on another one of those amazing ambiguous moments and listen to and watch a recording of Elizabeth Carani, who will be singing the role of Susanna, singing Susanna's Serenade de Vieni non tarda with Stuart Wilde at the piano, recorded in the French Institute in November. with Stuart Wilde. Here comes.
Have we lost Anna again?
Next panel event will be on April the 20th. It'll be on La Traviata with Radula Gaetanu, Matthew Kofi Waldron, Lauren Fagan, and Professor Linda Need. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, George. Thank you, Judith. Thank you, Nick.